I want to welcome everybody. I'm Mary Zirkle from the American Friends Service Committee, and we're so glad you're able to join us here tonight for this webinar, Eliminate the Pentagon Slush Fund. And this is just one in a series of webinars that a coalition of groups are doing to support the Global Day of Action on Military Spending, which coincides with U.S. Tax Day this year. And we're hoping to educate the public on a series of issues leading up to this date, which is April 14th and 15th. And I'm going to tell you at the end of the call a little bit about how you can join in action on this day, but we'll hear from Stephen and have a little conversation first. Before we begin, I also just want to take a second to thank the organizations that are co-sponsoring tonight's webinar, and that's Win Without War, Peace Action, U.S. Action, and of course American Friends Service Committee. And I do want to thank our tech team, Fitz and Larry here at AFSC, who've worked really hard to make today happen. And so let me just give a little introduction to Stephen Miles, who's our featured speaker tonight. And he is the coalition coordinator for Win Without War. Many of you may know him. Win Without War is a diverse coalition of 40 member organizations that formed in opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the underlying national security strategy that created them. And Stephen's a veteran of campaign politics with a strong background in grassroots advocacy. And he is the graduate of the London School of Economics from Tulane University with academic expertise in humanitarian interventions and Middle Eastern politics. And many of us who do this work, I think of Stephen as somebody who just perfectly straddles the policy wonk world and the grassroots organizing world. I always look to him for his expertise in helping us translate together. So we're so glad that you're here tonight, Stephen. Thanks for taking the time to do this. So why don't I hand it over to you?
Great. Well, I'm happy to be here, and hopefully everyone can hear me talking okay. So let's get right into it. We want to have a conversation tonight, and I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go through some slides. I'm going to give a brief overview in the beginning, and then we're going to try to move to question and answers because I'd like this to be a little conversational. So before I get started, I wanted to just say a word or two. Thanks, Mary, for the introduction. It saves me having to talk about myself, which I'm not a fan of. But I want to just thank and say a little bit about Win Without War. And why we exist and why we do this work. And I want to point out that all the sponsoring organizations are great organizations. They're all members of our coalition. And the coalition exists to provide that exactly what Mary said, that commonality, that coming together of not only what the right policy is, but what the right politics are, and to help Americans bring their voice into these debates. Because what we've found over the last 13 years of war in the U.S. is that the more Americans have their voice, the better off we are. And the less we participate in these conversations, the worse off we are. So things like this webinar and taking the time to educate yourselves are truly important parts of that. And we really want to thank everybody for coming out tonight and listening. And hopefully we'll have some great conversation in a few minutes. But let's get started. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about why are we talking about something called the Pentagon Slush Fund. We'll talk a little bit more in a second about what exactly we're talking about. But I wanted to talk about why we're talking about it. So hopefully everyone can see this slide that just popped up. It's the Pentagon Slush Fund oversees contingency operations. The official name for what we're talking about is technically called the Overseas Contingency Operations. But for shorthand, we're going to refer to it as the Pentagon Slush Fund tonight. You'll also see this abbreviated lots of places as OCO. You might hear it referred to as other things, the War Funding Account, for example. But for our purposes, we're going to call it the Pentagon Slush Fund. In front of you, you see a chart that summarizes for the current coming year the budget request that the president just released. And what you see is that 55% of that is for the military. This is an incredibly large amount of money. It outpaces all of the other things that Congress does and it spends money on. And I apologize for my cat jumping in the background here. And the Pentagon Slush Fund is about 10% of that. So we're talking about a lot of money here. It's something that's very, very significant and adds up to a lot of dollars and cents and dwarfs the size of other things like the Department of Education and other programs that we spend money on and that are tremendous priorities. So the scale of what we're talking about is incredibly dramatic. Move to the next slide here. So just a few quick background facts, a little bit about the Pentagon Slush Fund. We've got some bullet points here. We're going to walk through them. Since 9/11, the United States has funded its wars through a combination and a whole series of budget gimmicks and loopholes. The reason this started is because back in the first days of the Bush administration, when wars first start, there's always a period where you don't know what the cost is going to be. It's the beginning of a conflict, and there's some uncertainty for that. And what you normally do is you start and you go ahead and you do what's called an emergency appropriation. You shoot out some money, say this is an emergency, and when we do the budget for next year, we'll get back to it and we'll go ahead and see how much that costs. When they got to the Bush administration, however, what they did was they said that we don't want to show how much these wars cost. The wars were incredibly expensive. When you look at them compared to every war in the past, except with the exception of World War II, they ended up being more costly. So they didn't want to bring it back into the regular budget. And they continued to fund the war through a combination of a series of emergency supplemental spending bills and various other mechanisms. Gradually over time, as the costs began to mount and we got to get hundreds of billions of dollars, people started to say, this is really unconscionable. We can't keep spending money like this, pretending that we're not doing what we're doing. And what they did was they turned to a budget account called the Overseas Contingency Operations Transfer Fund, or OCO, and they said, we're going to use this account to once a year say, this is how much we think we're going to need for conflict. We're going to put the money in there. We're going to say what within the Department of Defense we're going to spend that money on, and you guys are going to have an honest accounting for what happened. This was started with the calls for Democrats when they took over in Congress in 2006. And when the Obama administration came in 2008, when they came in 2009, they really began to utilize this, and they shifted to what the hope would be a more honest and accurate way of accounting. I want to take a step back because this is never how we funded war. In the history of our country, we've never funded wars like this. The way it always used to work was you would do what I said, a one-time emergency supplemental, maybe two. You would say, oh my God, it's the middle of the year. You know, wars don't start on the budget cycle that we have prescribed for our Congress. So you have to do some sort of emergency legislation. But then the cost of war starts to become a bit predictable. You know how many people are deployed, you know roughly what they're going to be doing. And so we very quickly in the past always moved into just saying, this is how much money we're going to need for our military. Barney Frank summed it up best now to say what we do is we keep the military on a retainer, which is what's called in Washington a base budget. And then anytime we want them to do something above that, actually go out into the world and fight wars, we use special extra funds for that. Again, this is completely unprecedented. It did not exist before the Bush administration as a way of funding wars. So we get up to the Obama administration, and we've begun using this fund in a slightly more responsible way to say this is the totality of costs for what the war costs. But there's a trick. It still isn't quite in the department's budget. And so what happens is in the summer of 2011, you may remember back, we had a big fight over the debt ceiling. There was a threat of a default, and there was a last-second budget deal, technically called the Budget Control Act. It led to what you might have heard of as sequestration, and that bill did a number of important things for our purposes. The first was that it capped spending. Now, this was, for non-defensive spending, incredibly devastating. The Republicans who took power in Congress in the 2010 elections had managed to shrink the pot of spending on domestic needs, and that pot stayed shrunk at much lower levels. The Pentagon, which was at record high levels, got to essentially stay where it was. And then they said, if you guys can't agree to find more savings in what was called the super committee, we're going to go in and we're going to lower those caps by about $50 billion per year for both the Pentagon and for everything else. Again, the Pentagon, if you remember back to the earlier slide, it's about half of what we spend all of our money on. So the caps were 50-50 between the military and the non-military spending the government does. As everybody remembers, they didn't reach any budget deal. Those caps went into effect. That's the cuts called sequestration. And we're now living in a world where those are supposed to be the spending levels. But then we come back to this Overseas Contingency Operations account, the Slush fund. Well, when they did this, they said, well, war spending is different. You know, it's an emergency. We don't want to confuse our willingness to fund the war with these spending caps. So we're not going to cap those. So we've got this $500 billion, give or take, over here in the budget, but we're going to let you have whatever you need for the war. Now, for the first year, that was kind of okay. They didn't really have to make any cuts. They were just where they were at the Pentagon, so it wasn't much of an issue. But as they started to have to make cuts, as the budget began to make its way down when Congress couldn't reach further deals, the Pentagon really didn't want to make those cuts. And as we're going to see in a few minutes, they used the Pentagon Slush Fund, the Overseas Contingency Operations account, as the perfect tool to avoid making any of those cuts. So what you see, I completely apologize for my cat's unwillingness to stay away from the screen here. What you see in the slide in front of you right now is a brief history of the Department of Defense funding. You'll notice there's a large blue shaded area, and this represents everything before 2001, the entirety of what we spent. So you'll see there's a peak for Korea, there's a peak for Vietnam, there's a peak for the Reagan buildup during the Cold War, and in general, it's kind of creeping up over time. And then you get to 2001, and you have this weird thing happen where there's the dark blue area, and then the light shaded blue area that says OCO funding, OCO funding. That's the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So if you want to know how much we were actually spending on the military during those years, you have to look at that total area. What you see is it's an enormous amount of money. Now through the chart, you'll also see there's a thin line. It might be hard to see on your screen, but that represents the number of troops in the military at that time. And so when you look back during the Korean and Vietnam wars, we had about 3.5 million soldiers in the military. Yet we were still spending far less money than when we have 1.5 million now. And so there's lots of things going on there, but mostly to say that the military has gotten incredibly expensive. A lot of it has to do with the growth of contractors, wasting contractor spending. We could have a whole nother webinar, and I know you guys have, on those issues. But the reality is that we are just simply spending gobs and gobs of money. And again, to hide that, to prevent us from realizing that that shaded blue area was also part, not just the dark blue part, they wanted to create this off-budget gimmick, and that's where they came up with the Pentagon Slush Fund. That's where they came up with OCO. They didn't want to show that they were really spending $100 billion more than Ronald Reagan did at the height of the Cold War. They just wanted to show that we were spending about the same and try to ignore the fact that we're actually spending a lot more money. But what's going on here? When we look at the last couple years here, you can see an interesting thing on this next graph. The dark blue line, or the kind of thicker blue bars, represent the cost of Afghanistan per troop. So this is just Afghanistan. This is basically after we've started to wind down Iraq. This is just the numbers within that budget for Afghanistan. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were always separated out in that budget, so we can actually see pretty clearly what the difference was. But the thin green line that you see in there is the number of troops. So again, we all know the President Obama escalated the number of troops twice when he took office. You see that in 2009, again in 2010 when you get in there, and it peaks in 2011, right around 100,000 troops. And then in 2011, it begins to come back down. But what you see is we go from about $1 million, a little bit over $1 million for the cost of each troop, up to over $2 million for the cost of troops now in the last year. And it's going to be even more in the next year. Now, that's not because all of a sudden troops became twice as expensive. A little bit of that is because there's some things that you always have to pay for in the war zone that don't have anything to do with the troops. Some things like the cost of the base. Doesn't matter if there's one person there or 1,000 people there, that base costs the same amount. But in general, these costs have actually tended to stay pretty steady if you look, right around $1.25 million, $1.25 million per soldier, and then they spiked up. So something happened, and that's when this goes from being just a gimmick that they used to fund wars off the books to being a true slush fund for the Pentagon. In this next chart, and I apologize, I know that the numbers or wording is a little small here, but if you can read it, what you see is that there's two highlighted lines. There's a couple columns. The numbers on the left are what we spent in 2013 in the Overseas Contingency Account in the OCO Slush Fund. And then in 2014, what the military said they wanted. The important thing here is that in between these 2 years, the number of troops in Afghanistan was cut in half. So we have about half as many troops in 2014 as we did in 2013. Not exactly, but the number of troops was coming down pretty dramatically. But for the Army and the Air Force, they requested about 10% more money, 12% for the Army, 8% for the Air Force. That's a significant improvement. So why did that happen? Well, what happened was the Army and the Air Force, having to start making these cuts as part of sequestration, decide we don't really want to make those cuts. What we're going to do is we're going to shift a bunch of our costs over into the Overseas Contingency Slush Fund. We're going to take things that we always paid for, run-of-the-mill things like the salaries for soldiers, buying some of our weapons, things that are normal everyday expenses, have nothing to do with the war. We're going to take those, we're going to shift them over and call them a war cost now. There's about 30,000 troops that the Army was in the process at the time of slowly drawing down. They'd added 100,000 troops to the size of the Army over the course of the previous decade of war, and they were beginning to wind that down. Now, throughout those entire 12 years that those soldiers were in the Army, they were always paid for in a regular, normal way that we pay for the 1.5 million men and women in uniform. But then in the last year, all of a sudden we said, no, 30,000 of them we're going to pay for over here in this slush fund. And the only reason they did it was so that they could get around the spending cap. They could find a way to not cut money. And that's what you see on this next graph. I want to give a lot of credit to the good folks at the National Priorities Project. They did some really tremendous work, and it's summed up in this chart. In 2014, the year we're in now, there was supposed to be $54.6 billion cut from the Pentagon. Now, it's a lot of money, but it's about 10% of the Pentagon's budget total. It's an enormous budget. It's by historical standards, fairly modest cut, and it would have represented the first cuts in over a decade of building up the budget and cutting from, again, record high levels of spending. So what happened? If you remember back in December, Congressman Paul Ryan and Senator Patty Murray reached a deal, and the Congress passed a little bit of relief and a budget for the next 2 years. And the little bit of relief they passed was those $55 billion cuts were reduced by $20 billion. So now instead of 55, you're looking at 35. Okay, that you know, for non-defense was incredibly important. For things like WIC and programs like Head Start and other nutritional assistance and after-school programs and education programs, those extra dollars were life-saving. For the Pentagon, they didn't really need that money. It's money that they weren't going to necessarily, you know, they weren't going to have to close the doors if they didn't get that money. But it was important to get it back for non-defense, but Congress also gave it back for defense. But then, remember what we just talked about. They had already shifted a bunch of costs over from the regular budget that was supposed to be cut by $55 billion into the slush fund. And by estimates from the experts who looked at it, they did that with $20 billion. So now Congress gave $20 billion to the Pentagon hid $20 billion of regular spending in there, but they weren't done yet. Congress still, after they passed the budget, had to pass another set of bills that actually spent the money. And what Congress did when they did that was say, hold on, we still don't think that you can make these cuts. We still think that these cuts are too hard for the Pentagon to make. So we're going to give you $10 billion more money. So on top of all of that, the estimates are that Congress added another $10.8 billion, leaving out of that original $54.6 billion, $3.4 billion actually cut from the Pentagon last year, or less than 1%. I mean, these are the drastic, dramatic cuts that you hear about. There are politicians out there saying things like Ukraine happened because we're slashing and burning our military. 0.62 cut. That's what we're talking about, less than 1%. And even more important, everything on the other side of that ledger, everything from education to healthcare to taking care of veterans, those programs didn't get this dispensation. There is no multi-billion-dollar special slush fund off there to make sure that the cuts that education is receivable don't go into place. Their cuts went into a place, 100%, all of them. They got their cuts, but the Pentagon has completely avoided its cuts. I didn't have a number slide in here with absolute numbers. but you can kind of make it out on this chart. Well, actually, I'm sorry, we'll come back to this chart in a second. But the absolute numbers for the slush fund, the size of it, it's about $80 billion right now. That's the request for the upcoming year. The current year is about $85 billion. The previous year was $80 billion. So what you see is actually from 2 years ago, or from last year to this year, again, the number of troops in Afghanistan cut in half, but the amount of money went up by $5 billion. The only reason that happened is because of what we just talked about. All these various ways that Congress added in extra money. That's how you go from having 60,000 troops in Afghanistan to 30,000 troops in Afghanistan, and for those troops spending $80 billion and then $85 billion. This is a monumental lie that the American public is being told, and it's a massive, massive diversion from the fiscal reality that we're supposed to have at the Pentagon. The reason I want to make sure that this is understood is, again, it's on this slide. So if you see, there's lots of, there's kind of a history of the military and non-military spending over the last 40 years. You see various fluctuations. There's periods during the Reagan era where non-military spending was way down, military spending was way up. Then during the Clinton years, they kind of come back in alignment. And during the Bush years, the military gets another boost. There's the recession and the Recovery Act goes up. And then they both start to come down a little bit, primarily as the Recovery Act comes to an end. But I want you to look right at the very end, right at the end of this chart. And what you'll see is that the non-defense spending, again, Head Start, education, elder care, assistance for nutrition, all the things the government does, the EPA, the Department of Labor, all of that, that's still going down. It's still going down. But what's the military doing? It started to go back up. And the reason it's going up is because they're hiding that money in the overseas contingency fund. They're taking advantage of a loophole to continue to raise their budget in a way that other people simply aren't able to do. So I want to end right here, and I have lots of time to talk about this with questions, and I'll try to corral my cat and apologize again for that. But I want to leave, there's a quote on your screen right now. No one up here thinks this is a problem. It's only going to change if we make it change. So we were in Congress talking with a member of Congress about this and saying, this is a pretty dramatic reality. This is pretty shocking. And they said, nobody up here thinks it's a problem. This is really only going to change if you guys make us change it. And so that's why we're talking to you today. That's why we're out here. That's why groups like Peace Action and AFSC have asked you to participate and tell you about this, is that in Washington, this is business as normal. This is another day at the office. This is just another way that we prevent the truth from getting out and do business as usual. But it can change. But it will only change if we make it change.